So in this last PowerPoint, we'll look at, as we have with other media, issues and controversies that have cropped up over the years. The first, particularly with respect to broadcast journalism, is the issue of gender. That is equality in the newsroom and making sure that both men and women are given the same levels of responsibility and being paid at the same level of those responsibilities. And it's an issue in broadcasting simply because of the fact that and in journalism generally, that journalism and in broadcasting has really been dominated by men for a very long time, really since its inception. And yet, in most recent times, there are more and more women entering the newsroom. A women's media study in 2015 found that 45% of the people in newsrooms, broadcast newsrooms nowadays, are women. And women very often want to be on air, and very often news executives want women on air. They want the kind of the stereotype of the dual anchor is an older man with a younger woman. The older man brings authority, whereas the younger woman brings energy, looks youthful, and more importantly, looks pretty. The case that really was one of the first to be litigated with respect to women in broadcasting was brought by an anchor reporter named Christine Kraft in Kansas City. She was told that she was going to be demoted because she was found by a focus group to look older. Those not familiar with focus groups, basically what they do is stations, consultants gather 5 to 10 people in a room, and then they play various newscasts or various stories featuring particular reporters or particular anchors, and ask the group what they think of each of these people. This is what's known as a focus group. The thoughts can be on anything. They like the clothes they wear, they don't like the clothes they wear, too much makeup, not enough makeup, hair's too short, too long, whatever. And what this focus group found of Christine Kraft is that she was looking older than maybe some younger reporters at the station. At first, Kraft refused the demotion and said that she just wasn't going to take it and was going to stay on the anchor desk. And then eventually was said, well, then we're going to have to let you go. She filed a lawsuit, and at the lowest level of the court, she filed a lawsuit for discrimination, for gender discrimination, and she won at the local level, at the lowest level. And was awarded $500,000 for discrimination. But then it was appealed by the station to an appellate court, and the decision was overturned and the award was taken away. She tried to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court that this was indeed a violation of her civil rights, but the court refused to hear the case. And yet this is still an issue. Women in broadcasting, I know from personal experience that women in broadcasting are paid less because in broadcasting paid less than men. And the reason that there are so many women in broadcasting is because they are paid less. You can have the same amount of work with a woman and pay her less simply because she's a woman. This is a practice that continues, and it doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon. And another issue that's probably almost as important is corporate ownership. That is that media are owned by very large media corporations around the world. There isn't a mom and pop TV station or mom and pop radio station out there, or newspaper for that matter. There just aren't that many of them. If a TV station or a radio station is in operation, it is probably owned by a very large corporation somewhere. And that corporation has influence on what that radio station or TV station or newspaper does. And this can be particularly important with respect to news. A very big example of a corporation having influence on a news story relates to 60 Minutes. The question really is how much influence can they have, and will a corporation use its influence to protect itself as a corporation, as opposed to making sure that the public is informed. And this had to do with a story back in the 1990s that 60 Minutes producer Lowell Bergman had put together related to smoking and the investigations that attorneys general around the country, specific states attorneys general, were investigating and suing tobacco companies for insurance money. What they were arguing is that the tobacco companies were purposefully including in their cigarettes addictive substances that would keep smokers smoking their cigarettes. And what 60 Minutes, what Lowell Bergman had found is he had found a chemist that was working for Brown and Williamson Tobacco who was willing to be a whistleblower, to testify to government officials, agencies, that they were indeed including these addictive substances. It all was part of the subject of a movie called The Insider that came out in 1999 that had Al Pacino as Lowell Bergman and Russell Crowe as the whistleblower Jeffrey Wigand.
Would-be censors aren't always picketing outside network offices. Sometimes they work inside.
Please consider yourself to be under oath.
Yes or no? Do you believe nicotine is not addictive?
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
In a case that inspired the award-winning film The Insider, internal network politics led to the censorship of a news story. In 1995, tobacco whistleblower Jeffrey Wigand told 60 Minutes that tobacco companies knowingly added nicotine to make smokers addicted to cigarettes. But CBS silenced Wigand's whistle.
It was communicated to me by one executive in the news division that the corporation would not risk its assets on this story.
It wasn't just fear that motivated CBS and its chairman, Lawrence Tisch. At the time, Tisch's son, Andrew, was entwined in a business deal with Wigand's company, Brown and Williamson.
I think that we were deceived and lied to. I think that more is going on here than we even know now.
Corporate America can be very powerful. Is there intimidation? Yeah.
Instead of 60 Minutes, it was the Wall Street Journal which finally told the public what Wigand knew. CBS finally aired the report in 1996, but by then the story and the censorship of it was old news.
60 Minutes, I think they probably took the course of least resistance this time.
Really, the results of all this, the reason the Wall Street Journal exposed it is because Wigand, or Lowell Bergman, the CBS producer, went to them and told them what CBS, the corporation, was doing. And the Wall Street Journal then published all of the information that Wygand had. And then it was after that that CBS 60 Minutes aired the entire segment that Wygand was going to be exposing all this information. Bergman quit CBS almost immediately thereafter and went to work for public television and their investigative series Frontline, and has been a part of that for a long time now. Other issues are related really to content. What kinds of content are included in broadcast stories or in print stories, and are the journalists that put out this content, are they being truthful, or are they being ethical in their reporting? Probably one of the more famous instances here is Janet Cook, who was a reporter for the Washington Post. She published, reported on, wrote, and published in the Washington Post a series about young children who were addicted to heroin. And what she said she was doing was she was interviewing on a regular basis this young, I mean very young, he was about 10 years old, I believe, that this young boy, I don't know what his life was like. He was homeless on the streets. He was an addict, and she really documented his life on the streets and what he was going through, and really kind of told about the problems that homeless people have, and drug abusers have. And it was powerful. It was so powerful that it won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting. Problem is, it was all made up. She admitted eventually that there was no Jimmy, that it was all fiction. She used some of the information that she had from other stories she'd done, and of course, there's egg on the face of the Washington Post now and the Pulitzer Prize Committee. She was fired, and the Pulitzer money that the Post won and that she won had to be returned. But the question is, how do you? It's an ethical question for reporters and for the managers. You have to trust your reporters that what they're doing. They're being honest, and unfortunately, this is also why there are fact checkers in news organizations. Another infamous player is a young man named Stephen Glass. Stephen Glass had done writings for a lot of different magazines and small journals. But really the worst that he did was with the New Republic. He went there in 1998, and in their story meetings would come up with these interesting and fantastic stories, story ideas that he would really kind of flesh out during the meetings, and everybody would love his ideas, and then he would go and write these. And eventually what happened is that a competing journal, competing magazine, called up, and they wanted to get a little information, some phone numbers, because they wanted to do another story. It was about hackers, computer hackers, and they wanted to get the contact information of a couple of people that Stephen Glass had named in his article. But they've been trying to find them, and they couldn't find any of these people. And as they started investigating, they started finding out that conferences that he had talked about and described in his articles They were told it never took place. There were websites that were not on the internet. Things just weren't weren't real. Finally, his editors at the New Republic confronted him and asked him, what was going on here, and he basically broke down and said, "I made it all up." And 60 Minutes actually did a segment on him, and that he was a compulsive liar. He made things up because it made him feel good and it made his readers feel good. The more exciting he could make it, the better it was going to be, and more feedback that he got from his colleagues. And lately, actually a couple of years ago, he moved to California and applied for a law license after completing law school. And he had to go up to the state Supreme Court to see if they would allow him to have a law license, and eventually they refused because they evidently felt he wasn't trustworthy enough. It isn't just print material that has potentially made up material. An episode on Dateline that looked into GM trucks that had the positioning of their gas tanks in a vulnerable spot. There had been an accident back in 1991, I believe, where a couple of young people were killed after their GM truck had been hit from the side, and the gas tank exploded, and creating a fire that burned them. Dateline, in trying to investigate this, decided that they were going to reenact. They were going to go ahead and do the same thing. They were going to get a GM truck, and they were going to have somebody drive into it, all under controlled circumstances, and try and replicate the accident to see how vulnerable these trucks were.
In one crash at about 40 miles per hour, there was no leakage and no fire. But in the other, at around 30 miles per hour, look what happened. At impact, a small hole was punctured in the tank. According to our experts, the pressure of the collision and the crushing of the gas tank forced gasoline to spew from the gas cap. The fuel then erupted into flames when ignited by the impacting car's headlight. The pickup's tank did not split wide open. If it had, the fire would have been much larger.
No manufacturer can prevent all accidents, but what's at issue is whether deaths like Shannon Mosley's, where the victim burns to death, are preventable. The Mosleys say if they had any idea that people were being burned in these pickups, they never would have bought one for their 16-year-old son.
Michelle, is GM prepared to do anything about this?
Well, I think it's doubtful that GM will do a voluntary recall, since they deny there's a problem, even though they cannot say how many people have burned to death in them.
Which leaves the federal government.
General Motors is suing NBC News over a story carried on the network last fall.
We now face a poisoned environment spawned by the cheap, dishonest sensationalism of NBC's Dateline program entitled Waiting to Explode.
NBC acknowledges consultants place sparking devices on the trucks, but the network said the sparking devices had nothing to do with the resulting fire in the demonstration.
When in reality it did. There was no fire every time that the car hit the truck until they did a reenactment by putting sparking devices in the gas tanks, so that when the gas spilled, someone would ignite the gas and create the fireball that supposedly would happen naturally when the car hit the truck. So General Motors sued NBC, and eventually NBC settled out of court. and had to submit a public apology. There are other issues that are just would seem to be more trivial, but they still raise questions about our media with respect to journalism. The fact that news organizations tend to cover the same stories. There isn't a lot of diversity, meaning a variety of stories. So the question of duplication, why is everybody covering the same thing? Certainly the argument would be, well, they're covering the things that are news, that need to be covered, that are worth covering, and yet you can certainly make the argument that perhaps there should be a wider variety of stories should be covered. An issue that has been around for a long time is how close should news people be to their sources. Journalists depend on their sources and depend on relationships with their sources. So that what journalists want are sources to come to them with news stories, with news ideas, to alert them of things that are coming up, or that nobody else knows. This allows for exclusivity for the news organizations. Yet at the same time, news people tend to cover the same people over and over again. Consequently, you can get a little too close to sources, and if something is, or if questions are raised about those sources, then how are you, as the journalist who knows this source very well, how are you going to react to that? Are you going to cover it with as much energy as other news organizations might, or other journalists might? And there's ethical questions related to gift giving, and even to the extent of if you meet a source for dinner, and the source wants to pay for it, do you accept something like that? There are a lot of ethical questions that are raised with how close journalists are to their sources. And really kind of the last one with this issues PowerPoint we'll look at is advocacy journalism. That is, there has been a movement really over the last 10, 15 years or so for what's known as citizen journalism. That is, having people in the community cover their own neighborhoods and things that go on there, the issues that might be related or might pop up in their neighborhoods, and write about them and publish them on the internet. The question becomes, are these people trained to be journalists? Are they taking an unbiased, objective point of view when they're writing about particular issues or particular stories about people that they may know? Blogging has always been a problem for me. I don't consider it journalism. I consider it opinion writing. Bloggers are people who shoot out their opinion for the most part. Podcasts are something different. Podcasts are previously recorded kinds of programs that may have information, objective information, and not have opinions in it as much as it might. But bloggers are people who write about, who write opinions. And the question is it journalism? And I would argue that no, it's not journalism. But I think for me, the biggest question related to controversies and issues in today's climate is do we understand the importance of the press to our country, our democracy, our republic? We have a president who has basically declared war on the press. Many presidents in the past have not liked the press. They don't like when the press writes negative things about them, but they understand what the press does. They understand and accept that the press is an important part of our country. It's an institution that we need to keep us as a democracy, as a republic. This president doesn't see the press as anything but something that is against him, and he has made every effort to try and undermine the press, whether it is a legitimate effort or it is just trying to do something to an owner of a newspaper. This is something that we as citizens have to take very, very seriously, and we have to recognize that our press today is under attack. Our press is being pushed to its limits, and its credibility is being questioned by the supposedly most important person in the country. And we have to really support the press, and really, as I've said in class, I think even though the press is going through difficult times, particularly the newspaper sides of it, some of the best reporting in history has been done by the press in the last 3 years, trying in every possible way to keep the American people informed of the corruption that is taking place in the current government, and that this is the information that the public needs to make decisions in November.